The curse of the Thanksgiving table. Every family has its traditions, its little quirks that bring them together during the holidays. For my family, it was Thanksgiving dinner around an old oak table that had been in the family for generations. My mother used to call it the heart of our home. But now, we know better. My name is Daniel Miller, and I'm the last one left to tell this story. I've spent years trying to forget, but Thanksgiving always brings it all rushing back. What happened to my family wasn't just bad luck or coincidence. It was a curse tied to that table. The table had always been a point of pride for my family. My great-great-grandfather, Charles Miller, handcrafted it in 1876. It was a massive thing, made from a single oak tree that grew on our ancestral property in upstate New York. The wood was dark and polished, with intricate carvings along the edges, winding vines and snarling faces that I always thought looked more menacing than beautiful. Every Thanksgiving, the table came alive with plates piled high with turkey, stuffing, and my mother's famous pumpkin pie. My dad would sit at the head of the table, carving the turkey with his ancient silver knife. It was the same every year until 1997. That was the year my Uncle Brian sat at the head of the table. My dad had passed away earlier that summer, a sudden heart attack that shook us all. Uncle Brian, being the eldest remaining Miller, took over as head of the family. I was only 12 at the time, but I remember the tension in the air that year. My mom wasn't herself, barely speaking as she set the table. The rest of the family seemed subdued, like they were all waiting for something terrible to happen. Dinner started like it always did. Uncle Brian made a toast, raising his glass of wine with a wide grin. "Here's to new beginnings," he said, though his eyes flickered with unease as he looked at the empty chair where my dad used to sit. We all clinked glasses, trying to shake the shadow hanging over the evening. But as the night went on, something changed. Uncle Brian grew quiet, his face pale and sweaty. He pushed his plate away, muttering something about feeling sick. By the time dessert was served, he was slumped over in his chair, his breathing shallow. We thought it was a heart attack, just like my dad. But when the paramedics arrived, they couldn't find anything wrong with his heart. In fact, they couldn't explain what had happened at all. Uncle Brian died that night, his wide, staring eyes fixed on the carvings along the edge of the table. After that, things got strange. My mom refused to sit at the head of the table the following year. She claimed it was out of respect for my dad and Uncle Brian. But I could see the fear in her eyes. She made my cousin Lisa take the spot instead, insisting that someone needed to carry on the tradition. Lisa was 19, full of attitude and defiance. She rolled her eyes but agreed, plopping down in the chair with exaggerated flair. "See?" she said, smirking. "Nothing to worry about." By the time dessert came around, Lisa was gone. We found her in the backyard, her body twisted and broken like she'd fallen from a great height. But there were no tall trees nearby, no cliffs or balconies to explain it, just the cold, hard ground, and the faint smell of burning wood that clung to the air. By then, it was impossible to ignore. Every year, whoever sat at the head of the table met an untimely death. Sometimes it was fast, like Uncle Brian's mysterious collapse. Other times, it was drawn out. My Aunt Carol wasted away over 6 months after Thanksgiving 2000. Her doctors baffled by a condition they couldn't diagnose. The curse didn't stop with the deaths. The rest of us began to change, too. My mother became paranoid, muttering to herself about the faces in the wood. My younger brother, Tommy, started sleepwalking, always ending up in the dining room, staring at the table as if in a trance. Even I wasn't immune. I began having nightmares, visions of black, writhing vines and shadowy figures whispering in a language I couldn't understand. We tried to get rid of the table. In 2003, my mom hired a moving company to haul it away, but the truck flipped over on the highway, killing both drivers. The table was returned to us, completely undamaged. The following year, my mom burned it in the backyard, or at least, She tried. The fire wouldn't catch, no matter how much lighter fluid she poured on it. She screamed at the thing, sobbing as the flames danced around it, never touching the wood. By 2005, it was just me and my brother left. My mom had died the year before, wasting away in the same inexplicable manner as Aunt Carol. Tommy and I decided we couldn't let the curse continue. We needed answers. We dug through the old family archives, poring over letters and journals until we found a clue. My great-great-grandfather had carved the table from an oak tree that grew on what he described as sacred ground. According to his journals, the tree wasn't just old, it was ancient. He wrote about visions he had while carving the wood, of faces in the bark and voices in the grain. He believed the tree was a gift, something that would bind the family together forever. We also found something else, a name, Haroan. Tommy whispered, his face pale as he read the word aloud. The name appeared over and over in the journals, always accompanied by strange symbols and warnings. My great-great-grandfather never explained who or what Haroan was, but he believed the table was an offering, a way to appease whatever force lived in the oak. That Thanksgiving, we decided to break the curse. Tommy volunteered to sit at the head of the table, claiming it was his turn to face the family's legacy. I begged him not to, but he insisted. "If we don't end this now," he said, "it'll never stop." The night was eerily quiet as we sat down to dinner. Tommy took his place at the head of the table, his jaw set with grim determination. The rest of the chairs were empty, a stark reminder of all the family members we'd lost. As the meal went on, the temperature in the room began to drop. Frost crept along the edges of the windows, and the flames in the candles flickered wildly. Tommy's hands trembled as he gripped his fork, his knuckles white. "It's here," he whispered, his eyes wide with terror. And then, the table came alive. The carvings along the edges began to writhe, the vines twisting and curling like living things. The snarling faces in the wood opened their mouths, their silent screams echoing in my mind. The room was filled with the smell of burning wood, acrid and choking. Tommy screamed as black tendrils shot out from the table, wrapping around his arms and legs. I tried to pull him free, but the vines were too strong. They dragged him down, his body sinking into the surface of the table as if it were liquid. The last thing I saw was his face, pale and terrified, before it disappeared into the dark, swirling grain of the wood. I've never set foot in that house again. The table is still there, waiting, its smooth surface gleaming in the dim light of the dining room. I've warned anyone who would listen, but no one believes me. They say it's just an old family legend. But I know the truth. Every Thanksgiving, I can feel it calling to me, whispering in the back of my mind. One day, it'll claim me too. Story number 2. The Uninvited Guest. Thanksgiving at the Hudson House was always an event. My mother, Eleanor, was the queen of hosting, and our house became a hub for relatives from all over the state. Every year, it was the same, a table groaning under the weight of turkey, stuffing, and pies, a living room filled with laughter and loud conversations, and me, sitting in the corner, nursing a plate of food and wishing I were somewhere else. But Thanksgiving 2009 was different. It was the year we met him, the man with the smile that still haunts my dreams, the uninvited guest. I didn't notice him at first. There were so many people, uncles, cousins, family friends, that one more face in the crowd didn't seem unusual. He was just there, sitting at the far end of the table, his plate piled high with food, his hands folded neatly in his lap. He was dressed in a plain black suit that looked slightly outdated, and his slicked-back hair gave him the air of someone who had walked out of an old photograph. But it was his smile that caught my attention. It wasn't a warm, friendly smile. It was too wide, stretching across his face like it didn't belong there. His teeth were perfectly straight, gleaming unnaturally in the dim light. He wasn't talking to anyone, just sitting there, smiling. "Who's that?" I whispered to my mom as she passed by, balancing a tray of cranberry sauce. She glanced over, her brow furrowing. I'm not sure. Maybe a friend of your cousin Lisa? I'll check. But she didn't. The evening carried on, and the man stayed at the table, silent and smiling, as if he belonged there. I first realized something was wrong during dinner. The table was full, 18 people crammed into every available seat. But the noise seemed off. Conversations overlapped, voices rising and falling. But there was an undercurrent of something else. A faint hum, low and steady, that made my skin crawl. I looked across the table at my cousin Jason. He was in the middle of telling some story about his college roommate. But his words seemed muted, like I was hearing them through a wall. I turned to my Aunt Claire, sitting beside me. She was laughing, but the sound didn't reach her eyes. Her face looked wrong, too pale, too tight, like a mask. And then there was the man. He hadn't touched his food. His plate was still full, untouched, as he sat there, watching, smiling. After dinner, we moved to the living room for dessert. That's when people started disappearing. It happened so subtly at first that no one noticed. My Uncle Frank went to grab a beer from the kitchen and never came back. We assumed he was outside smoking. Then Aunt Claire excused herself to use the bathroom. But when 10 minutes passed, and she hadn't returned, my mom went to check on her. She wasn't there. The mood shifted. People started whispering, glancing around nervously. Where's Frank? Has anyone seen Claire? Maybe they went out for a walk? But it didn't make sense. Their coats were still by the door. Their phones left on the counter. They hadn't left. They had just vanished. And then there were fewer of us. I remember sitting on the couch, holding a slice of pumpkin pie I no longer wanted. The living room felt too quiet, too big, with so many empty seats. The hum was louder now, a droning vibration that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The man was still there, sitting in the armchair by the fireplace. His smile hadn't faltered. If anything, it had grown wider. I caught his eye, those dark, hollow eyes, and my stomach churned. Who are you? I blurted out before I could stop myself. His head tilted slightly, like a curious animal. I was invited, he said, his voice soft but resonant, as if it came from deep within the walls. It's tradition. What tradition? I demanded, my voice shaking. His smile didn't waver. Every family has its traditions. My mom tried to take control. All right, she said, her voice trembling but firm. Everyone, let's stay together. Nobody leaves the room. But it didn't matter. The hum grew louder, a pulsing, suffocating sound that made my ears ring. The lights flickered, the shadows in the room stretching and twisting like living things. And then, one by one, people began to vanish. They didn't scream. They didn't run. They just disappeared. One moment, my cousin Lisa was sitting beside me, clutching her phone with white-knuckled hands. The next, she was gone, her plate of pie sitting untouched on the coffee table. Lisa, I whispered, my voice barely audible over the hum. No answer. By the time the clock struck midnight, it was just me, my mom, and the man. The house was silent. The only sound the faint crackle of the dying fire. My mom was standing in the corner, her face pale and drawn, clutching a cross she'd taken down from the wall. I was frozen on the couch, staring at the man as he sat there, calm and composed. Why are you doing this? My mom asked, her voice breaking. What do you want? He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. I already told you, he said. It's tradition. This isn't real. I whispered. This can't be real. He looked at me then, his smile fading for the first time. His eyes, God, his eyes were endless, dark voids that seemed to pull me in. Oh, it's very real, he said softly. And it's your turn. I don't remember much after that. The hum reached a deafening pitch, the room spinning as darkness closed in around me. When I woke up, the house was empty. Everyone was gone. No signs of a struggle. No notes, no clues, just empty plates and half-finished drinks. As if they had all simply stepped away and never returned. I called the police, but they didn't believe me. They said there was no evidence that anyone had even been there. The neighbors swore they hadn't seen or heard anything unusual. The entire Hudson family had vanished without a trace. Except for me. It's been 14 years since that night. I've tried to move on. But every Thanksgiving, I feel it. The hum, the shadows, the smile. And sometimes, late at night, I catch a glimpse of him in the mirror. His dark eyes staring back at me. Waiting. Story number 3. The vengeance of the ancestors. They say the past never truly dies, especially when it's soaked in blood. We'd heard the stories growing up in our small New England town, whispers of massacres, unmarked graves, and restless spirits. But like most kids, we shrugged it off as folklore. Ghost tales meant to scare us on Halloween. We never thought it could be real. At least, not until that Thanksgiving night. My name is Eric, and I was there when it happened. I wish I hadn't been. Maybe if I'd listened to the warnings, to the whispers in the woods, none of it would have happened. Maybe my friends would still be alive. Started as a joke. Like most bad decisions do. There were 5 of us that year, me, my girlfriend Emily, my best friend Chris, his girlfriend Tara, and Tara's little brother, Liam. We were all home from college for the holiday, and Chris had the idea to make Thanksgiving fun by camping out in the woods near Plymouth Rock. Think about it, he said, grinning over his beer at the local dive bar. The first Thanksgiving was right here in Massachusetts, right? What better way to celebrate than by going back to where it all began? It's freezing out there, Emily said, rolling her eyes. And creepy. Exactly, Chris replied, his grin widening. It'll be an adventure. The woods were dense, even in late November, with skeletal branches reaching toward the cloudy sky. We pitched our tents in a small clearing not far from a crumbling stone monument. According to Liam, the stone marked the site of an ancient Native American village that had been wiped out centuries ago. The details were murky, something about a feast that ended in betrayal and bloodshed. The colonists had massacred the villagers and buried their bodies in mass graves. Do you really believe that? Tara asked, shivering as the wind howled through the trees. Why not? Liam said, shrugging. They don't put this stuff in history books. But you know it happened. People don't just forget about stuff like that. Enough with the ghost stories, Chris said, tossing another log on the fire. We're here to drink, eat, and have a good time. No one's rising from the dead tonight. If only that had been true. The first sign came after dinner. We were roasting marshmallows and joking about the cheesy Thanksgiving movies we'd grown up with when Liam suddenly froze. His face went pale, and he pointed toward the tree line. Do you see that? He whispered. We followed his gaze. At first, I didn't see anything. Just the swaying branches and the glow of our firelight reflecting off the trees. But then I saw it, a faint, flickering figure, barely visible in the shadows. It was tall and gaunt, its outline shimmering like heat waves on asphalt. Its eyes, if you could call them that, glowed with a faint, eerie light. What the hell is that? Emily whispered, clutching my arm. Before I could answer, the figure vanished. One moment it was there, and the next, it was gone, swallowed by the darkness. Probably just an animal, Chris said, though his voice wavered. Let's not freak ourselves out. But it wasn't an animal. We all knew it. The night grew colder, and the wind carried strange sounds, whispers, faint and mournful, as if the forest itself were crying. The fire didn't seem to warm us anymore, and the air grew heavy, pressing down on us like a physical weight. Emily wanted to leave, but Chris refused. We came out here to have fun, he said, glaring at her. I'm not packing up just because of some weird noises. Fun, Emily snapped. This doesn't feel fun, Chris. Feels wrong. She wasn't the only one who felt it. The air was charged, electric, like the moments before a lightning strike. and then the ground began to move. At first, I thought it was an earthquake, a subtle, rhythmic vibration that grew stronger with each passing second. But the ground didn't just shake. It swelled, bulging upward in patches like something was trying to push through. "What the hell?" Tara cried, stumbling back from the fire. The first hand broke through the soil with a sickening crunch. It was skeletal, its flesh decayed and clinging in tatters to the bone. Another hand followed, then another, until the clearing was filled with the sound of earth tearing apart. They rose slowly, impossibly, from the ground, figures in tattered clothing, their faces etched with rage and sorrow. They weren't entirely human. Their eyes glowed like embers, and their bodies flickered, half corporeal, like they were caught between worlds. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing Emily's hand. We bolted for the tree line, but the woods weren't safe either. Shadows moved among the trees, circling us, herding us back toward the clearing. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, a language I didn't understand but somehow knew was filled with rage. One by one, they came for us. Tara was the first to go, dragged screaming into the darkness by clawed hands. Chris tried to fight them, swinging a branch wildly, but it was no use. They swarmed him, their skeletal faces twisted in a grim mockery of triumph. Liam and I made it back to the fire, where Emily was waiting. She was clutching something in her hands, an old, weathered artifact she'd found near the monument. It was a small totem, carved with intricate patterns and symbols. "It's theirs," she said, her voice trembling. "I think they want it back." We placed the totem in the center of the clearing and stepped back, our breaths coming in ragged gasps. The spirits paused, their glowing eyes fixed on the artifact. For a moment, the forest went still, and then the wind picked up, a deafening roar that seemed to come from all directions. The spirits surged toward the totem, their forms blurring into a swirling vortex of light and shadow. The ground shook violently, and the air filled with the smell of smoke and decay. When it was over, the spirits were gone. The clearing was silent once more, the fire reduced to smoldering embers. But we weren't safe. Not really. We made it back to town just before sunrise, battered and broken but alive. The police didn't believe us. Of course, they chalked up our story to hysteria, a bad trip, or some elaborate prank gone wrong. But we knew the truth. Thanksgiving has never been the same for me. Every year, I light a candle and leave it by my window, a silent offering to the spirits we disturbed. I don't go near the woods anymore, and I've cut ties with anyone who asks me to. Some things should stay buried. Some stories shouldn't be told, and some debts can never be repaid.